Lambeth is approaching these subjects, and you will also be learning about HFL plans. We'll be sharing our own learning journey. Furthermore, we'll be inviting guest speakers from different areas and organizations to help us answering to some of the questions. At Homes for Lambeth, we acknowledge the difficulty to tackle sensitive topics around cultural norms, race, sexuality, or gender. And we also know how conversations about disabilities, mental health, neurodiversity are still uncomfortable to speak about. But we really want to push the boundaries and prompt debate to make a difference. We know that greater diversity is a critical success factor, since that enables individuals both to shine in their own right and as a team. Today, on the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, we ask what has changed for young Black men in our society, and more specifically, what has changed or is changing in the housing sector. Over to you, Abdi.
Thank you very much, Philippa, and thank you all for joining us today. As Philippa highlighted very eloquently there, we're here today on the anniversary of the George Floyd killing, which sparked a global outrage a year ago today. An innocent Black man going about his daily life, doing nothing, who was killed at the hands of a white police officer. It quite rightly triggered a global anger, which was felt here in the UK and across the world. And it's prompted all of us to look again how we approach the issue of racism, how we talk about racism, but also how we as a society perceive people of colour. As you can tell, I'm a person of colour myself, and I've got my own experiences growing up in Ealing in West London, growing up in a Somali refugee family who couldn't speak much English and came to this country seeking a better life. So I won't be talking for much, but I'll be chairing this event today. So I'd like to thank all of our attendees for coming. As I've mentioned earlier, you can participate via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and you can ask questions to individual speakers or general questions, which I will put to the panel. We have some great speakers with us. I'll introduce them as they're going to speak. But thank you all for coming, and I will start off with the first speaker, which is Jatinder Thakkar. Jatinder is the Chief Executive Officer of Homes for Lambeth and has been with Homes for Lambeth for nearly 2 years now, I believe. But Jatinder has a wealth of experience within the housing industry, and for any of you eagle-eyed ones out there, you will have seen that she wrote an article in Inside Housing yesterday about race and the housing sector. It's a really great article where she talks about her experiences within the industry. But I'll say no more further. I'm not going to ruin Jatinder's contribution, and hand over to Jatinder.
Thank you, Abdi, and welcome everybody to this first of our Let's Talk About webinars. Our Let's Talk About Race webinar was an idea pitched to me by one of our original interns, who's now an employee of the organisation, Philippa. Philippa asked me if we could have a session on race matters, and when I said yes, go ahead and organise, she gulped, but has done a fantastic job in bringing this subject to the fore, and with what I'm sure you will agree are some powerful speakers. HFL is a very young company, at officially only about 3 years old. That's when we were registered as a provider with the regulator, and only just under 14 months into its business plan. That business plan had just started when the news of George Floyd's murder exactly a year ago struck a powerful chord across the world. For whatever reason, it was this killing of a Black man that propelled many to mobilise and to demonstrate against the racism that young Black men in particular face. HFL and its employees were no exception. Perhaps it was the graphic images of his final moments or the demonstrable lack of compassion, but it captured racism in live action and in all of its consequences. Personally, as a woman of colour, the injustice of this killing was felt like nothing before. Years of grief and sorrow suddenly found a release, and I understood perfectly that others like me needed to talk about this moment. HFL held an open staff session where we talked about what this meant to us individually and it led us to talk about what we as an organisation could do. We had begun discussions on what our organisation should do in terms of equality and diversity, and this had a profound impact on our fledgling EDI group. We had started work on this area, building on the foundation that Patrick had started with Lambeth Council. Following the global demonstrations after George Floyd was killed, this work took on a much deeper significance. As an organisation, we want to make a lasting impact. If we complete our programme, it will take us 22 years. In that time, young children will grow up with us and enter adulthood. We know that the homes we're providing are of a much better quality than that which can currently exist. That's the reason we're doing it. Poor housing conditions are often linked to other areas of deprivation, lower education and employment levels, and poorer health outcomes. COVID-19 shone a spotlight on the far-reaching impact of race inequality. Is the virus more dangerous to poor people with fewer resources, or is it more dangerous to Black and minority ethnic groups? Are these overlapping and also way too often? In 2019, HFL created a resident engagement and social investment programme. During 2020, we accelerated this up the agenda. We could see that our estates has disproportionate numbers of Black and minority ethnic individuals and communities, and that they were being impacted more by the virus, whether physically or whether through fewer opportunities. We're a small organisation, but felt we had to do something to give marginalised groups a chance. That's why our intern and apprenticeship programmes have been directed at the people of Lambeth, and particularly on those estates where we're working. We didn't have to go far to find an enormous bank of talent. All they needed was the opportunity. Our EDI plan follows the same pattern and is a very pragmatic framework. We didn't want a tick box approach that says we've done everything right, but achieved nothing. Our 10-point plan embraces various practical applications, such as recruitment practices, pledging our support openly to marginalised groups, encouraging talent, reflecting our communities in our collateral and communications, and employee and board membership that reflects our communities. Data is important, and we're gathering evidence that shows whether we're succeeding in changing this narrative. One of our most impactful areas for change is our supply chain. As I said, we will, fingers crossed, continue on our path and be working in our communities for the next 20 years. We have the means to effect change by engaging our supply chains to also think differently. The organisation has come a long way in 3 years, and I am extraordinarily proud of the team at HFL, including the exec, the staff, and the board. This is an organisation that is trying to look, sound, and do things differently. We might not get it right first time, but we will make every effort to change the story. None of us gets this 100% right, and I'll give you an example of what happened with us at HFL. Here we challenge our own recruitment practices when we found that disproportionate numbers of Black and minority ethnic applicants were not finding their way to a successful placement in our apprenticeship programme. We could have just sat back and said, well, that's what our process has decided, so they must be right. Instead, we questioned what had happened. We made a deep dive into the issue. We saw that we had fracture points and made changes to our assessment processes with more diverse panels and assessment criteria, and a recommendation to employ the Rooney Rule. The new Code of Governance 2020 also puts a spotlight on equality within the sector, with organisations called to demonstrate their approaches. The housing sector has a little way to go in this arena. When we look at who we are housing, we can see inequality at play. Social housing has been rocked by the events at Grenfell, and the Charter for Social Housing Residents sets out clearly that we need to listen more to our residents and tailor our services better. Boards need to be more accountable to residents, and their voices need to be heard at this level. If we cannot or will not hear the complaints, the services we provide will never be changed, and we will continue to have more of the same, including ongoing inequality. Apparently, a loaded supertanker can take as much as 3 kilometres and 15 minutes to come to a full stop. and has a turning diameter of about 2 kilometres. A tugboat is a fraction of that size and obviously can turn much more nimbly. A tugboat can also help a supertanker turn around and face the right direction, example, Suez Canal. HFL is no supertanker, but more akin to that tugboat. We use our newness to do things differently, as we don't have any legacy baggage. This summer, we are going to try and publish some of the initiatives that we've pursued and share that on our website. This will include how we collect data, on what, our recruitment practice criteria, and the causes that we are openly supporting. I'm hopeful that some of our actions are easily replicated in some of those much larger organisations, and that together we can use the housing sector to start making some of those overdue changes in lives that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacinda. That was really something of substance of what Home to Lambeth is doing, where we've gone wrong, how we've reflected on those issues, and how we have tried to really address those issues. We'll be taking questions for Jacinda. We've already got questions for Jacinda. We'll be taking those questions towards the end of the event, but I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who is Patrick Vernon. Many of you will have heard of Patrick. Patrick is a commentator, a campaigner, a cultural historian, and more recently was an advisor to Lambeth on EDI. Patrick was also born in the constituency that Enoch Powell was once upon a time an MP, and many will remember or have heard stories of the speeches that Enoch Powell gave, and and the things that he used to say. But we're really lucky to have Patrick join us. I'm not going to speak for any longer because his work speaks for himself. So thank you very much for joining us, and Patrick, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here. It's really important. Today, obviously, we're marking the first anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. I've done about 5 events, so I'm halfway through. Still got the energy, so I'm still going through. But it kind of feels like Black History Month in one day. And the reason why I think this is it is because what happened in America has had a major reverberation impact. The theme of your event is let's talk about race. And the only time, sadly, we talked about race is during elections, which is very toxic, visceral, and counterproductive. But what happened last year with the murder of George Floyd and the reverberations of his murder across the world, that we started to have these conversations in Britain for the first time. Not for the first time ever, but there've always been these conversations. We could go back into the annals of history. John Blank, who was a trumpeter in the court of Henry VIII, talked about race when he wanted a pay rise. I'm the best black man playing my trumpet. I want a pay rise. Forget about the ethnicity pay gap. I want the money, and he got the money. You look at the likes of Olodo Equiano fighting black abolitionists who travel the country telling people about the horrors of enslavement, basically. He was having conversations about race. A few 1930s, Dr. Harold Moody, a doctor, GP, but also a campaigner, created the League of Coloured People in 1931. He was talking about race in the 1930s. Black seamen couldn't get jobs, they couldn't get accommodation. He couldn't even get a job working in the pre-NHS himself. Go to the 1960s. Martin Luther King came to Britain around about 1964. He did a stopover, spent a few days in central London, met some Asian, black and white activists fighting the colour bar in the early 60s. And they were so impressed, and they learned about his tactics around non-violence, that they formed their own organisation called the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, which played a key role in influencing and shaping the 1965 Race Relations Act, the very first act of Parliament, looking at issues around the colour bar, And if you go to the murder of Stephen Lawrence, we had conversations about race. When the Macpherson report came out nearly 20 years ago, we had big conversations about race, didn't we? across all sectors. And now we're having a conversation all over again. And the big question we need to ask ourselves, where do these conversations lead to us? Where do these conversations take us? And where do these conversations eventually land? And this is the big challenge for everyone, for all of us, not just for people of colour, but for mainstream organisations, for politicians as well. Where do these conversations land? And you can look at the last 12 months and we can look at some evidence of where it's landing. 2 million people took to the streets during the height of lockdown, black, white and brown, uniting together, supporting in solidarity Black Lives Matter and anti-blackness and discrimination and structural racism. The removal of Coulson statue, which for many years in Bristol has been a hot topic of debate, but nothing could happen. There were debates, motions, but it was still there. That statue was still there. And then on top of that, you have a whole range of local authorities, including Lambeth and others, who are now going through a process of looking at their public realm and their properties to refocus, rename, and look at things differently, to try and challenge this narrative of how great was Britain and where that wealth came from. So, and obviously there've been conversations, at all levels, corporates, FTSE 100 companies, Bank of England, Lloyd's of London, local authorities, NHS organisations and mainstream charities have issued their statements around Black Lives Matter, have made a pledge, have made a commitment, have had conversations internally with staff, with stakeholders, with shareholders and the public about we need to change this. We can't accept this issue and go back to the old normal. So we've had conversations, but where have they landed? And as you know, one of the things which Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, did in response to Black Lives Matter was to commission a report by Tony Sewell, looking at racial disparities, which came out, as you know, very recently. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the chat about this, but what's quite clear, and I'll work very closely with the Runnymede Trust in doing a response, other organisations regarding this report. And what's quite clear from the report, which was, when it was launched, it was heralded as groundbreaking thinking. It was heralded as celebrating multicultural Britain. It was heralded again with the word BAME. It was heralded as the next chapter in making Britain great again. But actually, that was all floss, wasn't it? Let's face it. We removed that veneer. That report was no different to reports that were written in Britain in the 1960s. Did anyone watch that TV programme called Subnormal on BBC recently about the horrors of black children? My age, actually, some of my peers were in that class of education subnormal in the 60s and 70s, basically. We were seen as second, third class citizens, despite the fact we were born here. Yeah? The report never talked about that. Did the report talk about the extensive use of stop and search and how it's over 200,000 stops in the last 14 months under the pandemic? Did the report talk about over 21 people who have died as a result of the hostile environment policy because of the window scandal? Did the report talk about how people who are aging in their 50s, 60s and 70s are not getting the care services that they need in the communities? Did the report talk about Grenfell and what needs to happen around social housing? There were lots of things that the report didn't talk about, but the report wasn't designed for that. The report was designed to stop us talking about race. That's what the report was designed for, because the report said things are hunky-dory, things are fantastic. If anyone is complaining about race or discrimination, it's your problem, and therefore it's on you, not on us. That's what the government wanted to do. They wanted to create this conversation, a different type of conversation, not the conversation that 2 million people were having, marching peacefully, demonstrating about equality, structural racism, but to have a conversation that things are fantastic, There's no structural racism. It's all based on your individual merit. Yeah. Now, if that was true, then maybe we could say they've got the evidence to prove that. But we know that it's not true. We also know that on top of that, the report itself is part of a wider conversation, which is now dubbed as the cultural wars. Now, it's not between Liverpool and Man United or Spurs and Arsenal. It's about the battle of ideology, or maybe the battle of minds. So, if I said to you that Britain made all its wealth from enslavement, made all its wealth in India and other parts of the world, and this wealth is still regenerating the economy, and that the talent, black and brown talent, is there but not valued and recognised. That's a conversation that the government does not want to have. They may want to have a conversation on certain individuals, and they'll say, yeah, maybe Nigerians are better than Caribbeans, Chinese are better than Indians, Indians are better than Somalis. You know what I mean? Or, you know, so this is the conversation that they want to have. So we talk about race in a linear fashion. But unfortunately, we live in a 3D world, don't we? Not in a linear world, where we know that the impact of discrimination, of racism, hurts people and sometimes kills people. That's the conversation that we need to explore around race. It's a conversation to talk about white allyship or comradeship, where we have a history of that in Britain, but the report doesn't want to talk about that. It doesn't want to talk about what happened during the time of abolition, around the rise of the Chartist movement, around what was happening around the colour bar in the 60s, or Rock Against Racism, or, you know, we have a long history of talking about race and constructively, but the government doesn't want to talk about that. They want to talk about a conversation around race whereby that actually slavery was actually a good thing for black people. It was actually character building. We should be lucky that we were saved and given a name and got a job, etc. You know, if you're of South Asian background, you're very lucky that we divided India and Pakistan in 1947. That's what you wanted, didn't you? You're lucky if you're lucky that we colonized parts of East Africa and we gave the other parts to Italy. You should be lucky and appreciate that. These are the kind of conversations that we don't talk about. They're not reflected in the curriculum. They're not even reflected in the media. We still have a myopic perspective on the media. It's a cross between still EastEnders and Brideshead Revisited. Basically, that is still the norm of how we construct the lens of narrative Britain. So when we want to have a conversation to talk about Black historical achievements, history of anti-racism, the history of struggle, and, you know, these are kind of things which are important, because if you look at the successes and the changes in Britain, it's often done through people coming together. It could be on an estate. It could be on one of your estates, where people come together and say, we want to tackle issues around knife crime, or we want to tackle issues of setting up a supplementary school, or we want to come together and establish a food bank. Then the question is, if people are coming together, then we need to work with them to support their ambitions, their goals. And that's why I think the work of your organisation is part of that conversation, having conversation on the estates, having conversations in the community to say, what do you need? How can we engage with you? Let's co-produce some ideas together. That is about a conversation around race. It's also a conversation around poverty. It's a conversation around the rights of residents. It's a conversation around equity. It's a conversation around aspiration for people on the estates, for their families and themselves. This morning, I put a tweet up about 6 o'clock in the morning, just to give a reflection of the murder of George Floyd and what it means, you know, the impacts of racism in Britain. And I got a lot of, you know, it's quite common now on social media. My good friend Diana, but each time she's trending on social media, you know it's going to be bad news. They know that someone's after her. You know, so I put something out on the social media, and I got this kind of hate mail. George Floyd, he deserved to die. America is a better place without George Floyd. That was the vitriol and rhetoric I was getting from people here in the UK, hiding under these silly avatars, basically. But also, I got, and then Abdi tweeted, put that tweet for this event today, and I got some emails. I got some tweets in response to my speaking today, and the emails were saying, "Why are you speaking at this event, Patrick? Lambeth Council policy on gentrification has not helped the local residents. Lambeth policies on housing is actually going the other way." And so, and one person gave me a message, "Patrick, if you want to be on this platform today, you know, raise these issues and concerns," which I've just done now. But I think under your leadership, you know that. We know there's been a history and a challenge in the past when things didn't work out in previous reincarnation of your organisation. The work I did with Lambeth Council over the last year and a half, looking at issues around having conversation around race within the council, and for the council in partnership with the trade unions to put their hand up and say, we recognise the structural racism in the council and we're going to work together on this. So we know that. The question is how you continue that conversation. The question is, how do you work with residents to say that we're on your side? The question is, in a place like Lambeth, where we know all the data around knife crime, deprivation, poverty, but we also know the evidence of aspiration, of talent, how do we harness that? That is a challenge for your organisation, as well as the council and the wider political leadership. But it's also an answer for local people as well. And in the context of Black Lives Matter, their lives matter, but our lives matter. But how we bring it together around the conversation of race, and we recognise that, as Tadin just said, you know, we could put a hand up if we make a mistake, but we will want to engage with you. It's that maturity of dialogue. It's that maturity of conversation, which unfortunately is not expressed at a national level. But you know what? It doesn't matter, because you can do it at a local level. And maybe one day the Prime Minister will want to come down to visit your states, and he might learn a lesson or two around co-production, around respect, around engagement, and maybe even leadership and transparency. But I won't go there today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And that was as usual, that was a very excellent contribution. And thank you for attending. And I was aware, I remember putting up that tweet and seeing the responses that you were getting. It was, I think, one of the things about this report was that the fact that the Secretary of State in charge of equalities couldn't name a single person that supported the report said a lot more about the report than I think any other thing that I've heard in recent weeks. There are a couple of questions that people are asking about how housing, and specifically, obviously we're a housing company, and how the housing sector can influence government to make changes in primary and secondary syllabus to incorporate better Black history in the mainstream history lessons. And do you think this would shift perceptions in young people before their personal views become negatively entrenched?
Well, I think it's important. If you look at the history of the housing movement, let's face it, the Windrush generation played a key role in the housing movement in the 50s and 60s. Some of the major housing associations that exist today were created as a result of what was happening around the 60s. You had dodgy, unscrupulous landlords, charging exorbitant rents, poor quality accommodation with henchmen if you didn't pay the rent. And through that that led to a massive growth and expansion of the housing movement. And ironically, you would think that in 2021, if you compare the housing, social housing world, I know housing's been in existence. I'm one of the ambassadors for the Almhouse Association. So obviously, you can go far back to the medieval period when we talk about social housing. But if you're talking about, post-war modern housing, you'd think that this sector, which is a young sector, if you compared it to the NHS or even local government itself, to be quite honest, would have more BME chief execs, directors at all levels, and you'd have a massive, but that doesn't exist. So it raises a question about if as part of your social investment strategy, yes, Black history, not just Black history, but all histories, LGBT history, the history of of migrants, history of gender and intersectionality is quite important. So young people know that. But I think it's also about creating those opportunities. You talked about apprenticeships. I saw something in the chat about what about people in the 50s who want a job. The wealth and the power and the multiplier effects that housing providers have. In many ways, you're in a much stronger position, ironically, compared to local government and the NHS, because you have unfettered cash, money, and resources that you can use and harness for social good. The question is how far you push that social good, in terms of the work that you do, not at a localized level, but as a collective social entity, in terms of harnessing that wealth and using that to do stuff. I know that there were a number of housing associations that got carried away around buying stuff and investing in all kinds of stuff, which went pear-shaped. But you can learn from those lessons, but you can do much more in terms of influencing the whole stuff, where not just place-based stuff, but national stuff as well. I really believe that.
And just on there, actually, we obviously, and you're quite right, organisations from time to time turn around, it's all Black History Month, and all of a sudden they're all wheeling out their checklists of things that they're doing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
What do you think is one of the hardest aspects of organisations, or where do they not get it right when it comes to diversity, do you think? What's the common mistake that they make?
It's having the conversations. It's having the conversation at the board and making a commitment. It's having that conversation at middle management level and delivery. It's having a conversation with the frontline staff and supporting them on the ground. It's having a conversation with the residents, so they believe that they're going to get quality services and they believe that they can be involved in contributing to that. We don't have those types of conversations. Often it's either one way. We are telling you this is what you will need, because based on the evidence, we will tell you what you need. Or the alternative is, you have lots of anger. I mean, I was a councillor in Hackney. I used to go to various TRA meetings. Trust me, when you go into a rough TRA meeting, it's no joke. You know what I mean? They'll take you as prisoners all the time, and quite rightly, because they are frustrated. I mean, they may be frustrated in their own lives, but they're frustrated that they want to have a quality service and they want to live in quality surroundings, no different to properties worth £2 million across the road. So I think it's that equity that we need to do and embed. If we don't embed that equity, then we reinforce stereotypes. And as I said to you before, you'd think by now that housing associations would have greater senior management at all levels. It's very disappointing, to be quite honest. It feels like it's a very exclusive old boy network, even though it's a young industry.
Yeah, it turned into that very quickly as a young industry. Well, one question, I guess a lot of the frustration comes from also inequality and a lack of, kind of investment in those kind of communities. What do you think of asset-based community development? That's a question someone's asked in the chat.
I'm a big fan of that, and obviously there's 10,000 models of that around how you approach that. So, I mean, if it's a model that you're using in your organisation, then working out what model works for a place like Lambeth. A model of some aspects of community asset building works in a place like Lambeth, but it may not work. But it may not work in other parts of London or other parts of the country, to be quite honest, as well. Asset base is important. Asset base is about social capital. It's actually acknowledging that there are no deficits in the community. Yes, there's challenges. We know that there's big issues and big challenges, big social issues, but there's also assets in the community. And if you can identify those assets and harness those assets, then that's all part of that process. I mean, under the Localism Act of 2013, there was a big move around neighbourhood forums, or there was a big move around community asset transfers, but that's virtually stalled. Nothing's happened around community asset transfers. I know that Lambeth had this model some years ago called the Lambeth Cooperative, and that's gone by the wayside now. But they were exploring the idea of creating models. social enterprise models or community asset-based building. I think in the context of post-COVID, well, what we've seen in post-COVID is that loads of community organisations have come to the fore. Mutual aid societies have come to the fore in creating a whole new infrastructure and building the current infrastructures of community giving. I think you, as an organisation, you have an opportunity to build on that and work in partnership with that and help to tackle those kind of inequality issues, which are now going to be pervasive. More and more people who've got COVID will have long-term COVID, and they can't work full-time, they might only work part-time. Is there opportunity to look at your employment practices? So there's flexibility in work. Maybe that might be happening already with some of your employees about that situation. We know that we've got massive youth unemployment. How can we divert young people away from a potential life of crime into a potential life of being a housing professional? These are some of the challenges that I think you can grab and take forward.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much, Patrick. That's all the questions that we had for you, and thank you for your contribution. I mean, yeah, you covered all the questions I had and some of the questions that were asked. I know you have to go off to your next event, so thank you very much for joining us.
But hopefully I'll come back again, and to keep up the good work, we'll have to catch up for a real coffee or something.
Yes, definitely. Yes, yeah. I'll put that in the diary.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'm gonna move on to our next speaker. Where's my running order? And that's Eamon Lorimer, who is one of our social investment coordinators focusing on employability. You'll see Eamon always talking about the great employability program we have for our residents, whether that's internships, apprenticeships, work experiences, and making sure that our residents on our estate can benefit from those programs. So I'll hand over to Eamon, and yeah, over to you, Eamon.
Thank you very much, Dean. It's a shame that Patrick had to leave so quickly, because as you all know, we are involved with the conversation of making things better for our residents, but then as well as the conversation, Homes for Lambeth believe and do deliver. So it's not just about talking about it, it's actually finding ways to actively make lives better for it. And an example of that is that when we employed 9 apprentices in January this year, that was actually 1/10, or so that was a 10th of our workforce were apprentices, 5 of which were Lambeth residents. So that's evidence of us delivering what we say we're going to be doing, and say the evidence of us delivering. But why is it important to have this discussion? I'm going to speak to you from a personal perspective, and then bring you up to date from what we're doing from Homes for Lambeth. So prior to joining HFL, my main career was in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, working in the diplomatic service, where I was posted to work in the embassies in Washington, DC, the British High Commission in Malta, and the British High Commission in Pakistan, as well as representing the UK at EU meetings in Brussels, and doing, believe it or not, chemical and biological weapons issues, where I spoke at a UN conference. And most people, when I say something like that, they say, wow, that's great. It's fantastic. However, during my time while I was representing my country, at my first posting, true story, people were taking bets in the early 90s when I was arriving at the post of whether I was black or not. They heard a rumour that I was black, but they were betting to see whether that was a true case or not, of somebody arriving to work in the British Embassy in Washington being a young black man. Then, when I was responsible for inviting people to cocktail receptions on British Navy ships in Malta, I was asked by one of the people who attended the cocktail reception, what embassy or what High Commission was I representing? And I told him with glee, the British High Commission. I'm the reason why you're on this ship. And the man from the British Legion was a little embarrassed, but and surprised that they were letting my type work and work for the British government. And then when I was in posting in Pakistan, and I befriended some local people who worked in the High Commission. And at the time, this is the late 90s, and I always would go out with a colleague for a lunch. And my colleague, you know, one time we were particularly busy, so I said, well, let's stop and have lunch in the British Club, which is the equivalent of the embassy of the High Commission Club on the premises. And my Pakistani Christian colleague said he couldn't do it. And I thought, and initially he was embarrassed to tell me why he couldn't do it. But so I pushed him. Why couldn't he do it? Because in 1997, the people of Pakistani origin or descent were not allowed to go into the British Club as a guest. They were allowed to go in there and work and serve, but they weren't allowed to go in there as a guest. So the point what I'm making here is that though on the outside that an East London black man with parents who came over from Guyana in the West Indies in the early 1960s ended up working and representing the British government. And above me, I've got a picture of me and the Queen when I met her in Washington. Yet all of that stuff was happening at the same time in my career whilst I was serving my country. And there's a final story to say it just didn't happen overseas. When I was in between postings, I had the pleasure of buying a brand new car and then driving with a mate of mine. You know, I got pulled over and stopped. I asked the reason why I was stopped. I wasn't told the reason why I was stopped, and I knew it had to be because I was black and driving a nice car in East London, because I knew that the car was registered to go for me to go and take overseas, and it was and it had to be legally and legitimately done because I was doing it. I bought it on behalf to use while I was working for the British government, and they stopped me. They searched my mate in next door, or not my mate who was sitting in the passenger side, asked him to empty his pockets. And then after a while, when they accused me of being a bit of a stroppy black man because I wasn't actually answering all of their questions, I actually said, I need to know the reason why you're stopping me. And if you don't tell me the reason, I would like to take your badge and your number, please. They eventually let me go. All of that happened as part of my career. There's many other stories I could tell you about. And the final one, which is an experience, while I was serving at the embassy in Washington, I was serving in the embassy in Washington when Rodney King murder, the Rodney King beatings took place. Where and at that time, I also got questioned by the police for just standing outside waiting for my girlfriend to go for a meal. Okay, so that shows that racism has existed for a number of years throughout my life, irrespective of the career and the type of job you've had. What's the difference now with George Floyd? The difference now with George Floyd is, as the previous speaker just said, when there was protests against what had happened, the protests which against what happened, the people who there's been a distinct shift in attitudes. There was the people who was responsible for taking down the Coulson statue in Bristol. The majority of the people who actually ripped that down were not black people. The people who were marching in London and London, against racism and against and saying that Black Lives Matters. It wasn't just Black people. I remember the Brixton riots. I remember the New Cross fire. I remember the Tottenham riots, and that, you know, the percentage of people, it was generally Black people, people of colour, were talking about not being treated fairly. This time, which was wonderful to see, it was a totally mixed set of people. You know, young people, old people, white people, Black people, brown people, it didn't matter. They were just marching because of justice. And it was something which happened across the world, which tells me, you know, the shift in attitudes is heading in the right direction, even to the extreme of when, you know, the English Defence League were protesting against the Black Lives Matters movement. There was a Black man from Lambeth who helped one of the English Defence League when he fell on the floor to stop him being trampled on. That shows there is a shift going on, even though there is time and there's other things that need to be done. So, okay, here I am now working in Homes for Lambeth. Now, one of the reasons, when I left the diplomatic service and I did some mentoring, I was a mentor for the Prince's Trust. And one of the things what I noticed when I was a mentor for a Prince's Trust, that if you were not born with a silver spoon in your mouth, and what that means, privileged, the struggles for somebody was near enough still the same. It was hard to get into certain careers. It was hard to get into certain jobs. You know, I was brought up with the mantra, it was expected for me to work harder. Why? Just because I was Black. A Black man. But Homes for Lambeth, after when I supported people with the Prince's Trust, it's moving in the right direction. It's actively doing its best to be inclusive. It means to say what it does on the tin. When we want our employees to look like the residents they represent, and we're doing whatever we can to make that happen without dropping the standards to let people think that they're getting a job without working for it. We're doing what we can, and it's a difficult discussion, and we're on a journey in terms of doing it. But that is one of the main reasons why I'm working for this organisation, because it's helping make a difference to people generally, but then also being as inclusive as it can through the different programs we run. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Eamon. And those are some points that you mentioned. Looking at your career, the experiences you've had. If you don't, we're going to take questions at the end for everyone, because there are some questions directed to you. So I'll take those questions shortly. But I'm going to move on to Sam now. Sam Herrell is our Director of Operations. She joined us in January of this year. Sam is another leader in the industry, and we were really excited to have Sam join us in January. Sam leads the team that looks after our resident engagement, our housing management, some of the biggest parts that Homes for Lambeth, that a lot of issues come up from in terms of equality and talking about race and colour. So I won't say any more, but I'll let Sam speak. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Eamon. I think this is such a fascinating subject for me. I've worked in housing operationally for almost 25 years, and never, ever have we spoken about the Black male experience. We've spoken about BAME, we've spoken about ED&I, but we've not spoken about actually what does it mean to be a Black man and living in social housing. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, it's really drawing on my experiences and my observations and my perceptions of how I see Black men treated within within their homes, within their tenancies, and how sometimes our landlord practice can actually cause more harm than good. So I was trying to find some statistics around Black men in particular, and there's lots of statistics in there in terms of diversity, but some of the statistics that I found I wasn't even aware of. And some things are for Black men in particular, but some are just across the board for Black people. So some of these you might be aware of, and some of them you might not. So if you're Black, you're more likely to be a looked after child, and you are less likely to be adopted. If you're a Black man, you're going to live 10 years less than your white counterparts. If you're Black, you're 3 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. You're 3 times more likely to be permanently excluded from school. You're 5 times more likely to be statutory homeless. And you're 3.5 times more likely to be arrested if you're Black. If you go to court and you get a prison sentence, your jail term is going to be 50% longer, and you're more likely to be denied bail. And we know that deaths in police custody disproportionately affect Black people, and in particular, Black men. If you're Black, you're more likely to have a psychotic episode. And the suicide statistics show that you're more likely to commit suicide than your white counterparts. So those are some of the statistics, and they're really quite uncomfortable. But actually, it's those statistics that inform the more harmful stereotypes that surround Black men as being criminals, as being mentally ill, as being violent and aggressive, being drug dealers, being gang affiliated, being terrorists. And all these things somehow seep their way into our housing management practice. But I think in terms of when we look at the Social Housing White Paper, which is the most recent legislation that's come out, or proposed legislation, is that there's a very strong theme that residents, and this is all residents, must be treated with respect. They must have their voices heard by their landlord, and they must live in a quality home in a good neighbourhood. Now, when I reflect on how this applies to Black men in my experience of delivering housing management practice on the ground, I don't think that always applies. When I was a young housing officer, my very first eviction, and it's one that stayed with me, to this day, because I can clearly recollect it and account for it, is that I evicted this young Black guy, and he was HIV positive. He suffered with mental illness. He was a recluse, and he wasn't paying any rent, and thus he was evicted. And when I went into his property, his living conditions were absolutely terrible. There was rubbish everywhere. There was no furniture. There was one solitary mattress on the floor. It was damp. There were rats because of all the rubbish. And this is something that's always stayed with me. How did this happen? Why did it happen? What should have been done differently? And why was this young Black guy left in these circumstances? Not only is it a failure of us as a landlord at that time for the organisation that I was working for, but also of society and other statutory agencies. So how do these statistics and stereotypes interface with our housing management practice? And I think it does start at the very beginning. There's a real failure to address unmet needs. The statistics speak to us. We know it's driven, people come into our housing because they're driven by deprivation, there's inequality, and also there's trauma. There's historical trauma there. And there's poverty, and their mental health needs. And we push Black men into general needs housing, and we expect them to get on with it, and we expect them to cope. And actually, very often, they struggle and they don't cope because we've not met their very needs from the very beginning. And then on top of that, when they display an inability to manage their tenancy, or a frustration with the services that the landlord's providing, we devise policies that disproportionately impact them. And we silence their voices at the same time. So not only do we categorise Black men as a problem, that they're a risk, that there is something that staff need to be protected from. So what's the narrative that's going on here? You know, black guys, they do get frustrated with the service levels. If the service is poor, they demand more. But very often they're dismissed, either because of the poor housing management or because of covert discrimination that's going on. And then this leads to a vicious cycle of more frustration, more persistent demands, and therefore a stronger policy response, which is where the stereotype comes into play. These individuals are seen to be a risk, service sanctions must apply, and then you just perpetuate the cycle. And then it gets legal, there's injunctions, and then for the individual, the young black man, the older black male, there's a complete disaffection with the landlord. So we know that black men's satisfaction levels, or black people in general satisfaction levels, because I don't think we segment it to that degree that I've ever known, is lower than their white counterparts. So it's very often these policies and our actions as a landlord that can indeed cause more harm. Yes, there's a balance to be had. We need to protect staff, but also we need to listen to our residents, to our black male residents in particular. And there was one case that I witnessed, was a young guy with mental health issues, and the contractor attended his property, and it was at the height of the terrorist threat in London. And the guy had a samurai sword, and he took it down and he was showing the contractor, but the contractor went back, he reported it, the guy was a terrorist, and that was it. This individual didn't get any further services, complete shutdown, nobody will go to the property, contractors refused to go to the property. Whatever the issue was exacerbated the individual's mental health condition, and then he was sectioned. So actually we could have responded and dealt with that situation a lot better. And I think one of the things that we do too often is we talk about BAME, or Black and Minority Ethnic, as one homogeneous group. We don't necessarily explore or understand the nuances of the Black experience, particularly the Black male experience, and how that might differ and how that might require a different landlord response. I think one of the other issues that as a sector we need to grapple with quite quickly is this failure around quality of the home. Now, ITV's recent campaign featuring a landlord in London of a tower block, all the individuals that were spoken to within that tower block were Black. All of the individuals said that they reported the problems that they were experiencing to their landlord, but they weren't heard. They weren't listened to. So what's going on there? They were ignored. And I think one of the problems that as a sector we don't do well enough is we don't really dig down into the statistics. We need to get better at monitoring data, collecting data and monitoring data, and not for data's sake, but to understand and ensure that we are delivering our services equally to all our residents, including Black men, but understanding where the outliers might be. So for example, do Black men have higher rent arrears? Are they more likely to be evicted? Why do they have lower satisfaction levels? Why is there a lower level of engagement? Why are they disproportionately impacted in the antisocial behaviour actions or injunctions? And I think it's improved understanding of this data that will enable us to shape a better response as a landlord overall to this particular resident group. And what else can we do? I mean, I think, you know, as I said from the outset, we need to ensure that the needs of Black men are fully met from the start of the tenancy, that they have the opportunity to succeed in tenancy managed, in the success of their tenancy, that they have the ongoing support, whether it's delivered directly through the landlord or it's delivered through third parties, because we need to address any emotional or practical requirements that those Black guys might need. And also we need to ensure we employ more Black men at all levels of the organisation, not only those who are trained to provide support and learning and listening, but also those men that can influence and lead the organisation to deliver a better response moving forward. And as I just outlined, I think the third thing is really to understand our data and understand how our practice impacts Black men in particular. And I think my fourth thing is around listening to Black men, and our engagement strategies need to be shaped around their needs, We need to listen to them. We need to understand and learn from their individual experiences, because it's only when we do that that we will be able to change, deliver and improve our services moving forward, and ensure that we don't have that discriminatory, stereotyped approach to delivery of our housing management service.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sam. Those were very direct kind of solutions to the problems that you highlighted from your, your wide-ranging experience within the sector. And, I think we're fair to say we're very lucky to have you in the position that you are, because, you've seen it all, and, you can make those practical changes in your role. And yeah, thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Before I go to the next speaker, just a reminder, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. You'll see there's a box has answered. I'm going to put those questions at the end to all of our speakers. So carry on putting the questions in. I'm keeping a tally of all those questions, and I'll put them to our speakers at the end. Now, last but not least, our speaker is Jason Emile. Jason is our Director of Development, looking after, as it says on the tin, all of our development programs. So from planning stages to construction, and Jason has been with the organisation, I think, the longest here on this call. And has a wide-ranging experience within the sector, building homes. And again, another person that we're lucky to have because of his experience. And Jason's going to be talking about what's next for Homes to Lambeth. What are we doing? What practical steps are we taking to address the issues that we've talked about here today? So I'm going to share my screen. Apologies if it goes wrong, but.
So whilst you do that, Abdi, I hope everyone can hear me. There's been some powerful narrative today, I think we can all agree. And the purpose of my presentation is really to talk about, what does this mean for HFL as an organisation? What tangible things are we as a business going to put in place to try and drive positive impacts within the borough moving forward? As sort of touched on earlier by Jatinder, we're a relatively new organisation, and we felt because of that we had the ability to set really ambitious targets. We weren't bogged down with legacy. We could set our standards as high as we could, and try to strive for that. We also recognised that within the borough, and because of the demographic of the business, and it's all work within the borough, and scale and size and timeline of the delivery programme, that we could really have an impact within Lambeth and influence what we wanted to commit to. Because of the scale of the delivery programme, we could influence our objectives in terms of the ambitious targets that we wanted to set out. We also wanted to crystallise our approach on this, and whether that was within our business plan or moving forward in terms of crystallizing the data and our objectives and how yearly we react to that. And I think as Sam touched on earlier, data is a key element. It's not just about setting these ambitious targets, it's how we go about and setting out a plan of how we achieve these and continually to monitor. We're a new organisation. There'll be things that work, things that don't, and we have to be diverse and dynamic enough to reflect those targets. The process and the proposal that I'm going to run through today, was driven by, I'm pleased to say, the whole organisation within HFL. It wasn't just a senior leadership, strands where we took control and we drove these thought processes through. It was a real collective input by all the organisations throughout different levels, and that really, for me, really pleased me in terms of the approach, and that with the culture and the ethos were all aligned within the organisation. It also meant that we were able to sort of distribute roles and responsibilities throughout the organisation. So everyone's involved, everyone has an input, everyone sort of monitors how everyone else is doing in terms of achieving our goals. And I think that gets the buy-in by all members of the team. And in essence, we're all pulling in the same direction. We also have worked closely with colleagues at Lambeth to ensure that the work that they're doing has synergy with what we're doing. And we've also gone out to the market because there's very many organisations that have been, out there and have been working this cause for many, many years before us. And are further down the road than we are, and we're always talking to other organisations collaboratively and really collectively trying to strive to make sure that as an organisation we can achieve what we'd like to achieve. So just to go into the brief review of this presentation, we created what we called an EDI roadmap. And this roadmap that I'm going to sort of briefly go through today is really about how we tackle recruitment within our organisation. But for every strand that we do within HFL, in terms of supply chain, procurement, contracts, whether that may be consultants, we use the same kind of strategy, and we have things covered within our policies to go through the same kind of roadmap, depending on what strand that is. So in terms of the key things that we wanted to take forward is monitoring and data setting. So like I said, really setting aspirational targets, not being afraid to necessarily fail on those targets, but being really aggressive and ambitious with them. And also monitoring that, publishing those targets so everyone is aware what we're trying to strive for and aim for, and publishing our progress and data, and helping the wider employment team and HFL wider team to understand the goals and commitments. We talked about taking accountability, so making sure the senior team within HFL drive the accountability. Preaching the same message throughout, both internally and externally within the organisation, and talk about being open about how we try to achieve our success within our organisation and within our boards. We also mentioned about raising awareness and getting employees to raise awareness of issues within organisations. This is through training. This is through what people perceive and see and experience on within the organisation. We've already undertaken throughout the business training on unconscious bias, tailoring particular workshops off the back of that, and providing sort of mentoring, sponsorships, and leadership within the organisation to hit our achievements. We constantly review and examine, the efforts that we do. We've looked at, in particular, a bit more detail in terms of recruitment and how we can better get a cross-fertilisation on candidates. Traditionally, there was a certain way of procuring, recruiting staff, and we've looked at ways that we can better that, and using the platforms that we've got out there now in terms of our social media and getting a greater awareness of the organisation. HFL has only been in fruition really for a couple of years, and we really want to get that message out within Lambeth about what we do, what we're about, and the targets we're trying to achieve. And it's about really being flexible and dynamic enough to recognise change, and having teams that identify with that and have the same culture, and being open and upfront about and transparent about reward recognition, improving supply chains. That's a really big thing, in the work that we've done in collaboration with Lambeth. It's fair to say that as a big sort of employer within the borough, there's a lot more that can be done in terms of supply chains and really promoting local businesses, local organisations, and having that kind of interaction and synergy between Lambeth, HFL, and potential supply chains in delivering our programme. And it's also about really establishing and mapping out career paths. It's not about, like we said before, just ticking boxes. It's about putting processes in place, monitoring them, and having defined career paths to ensure that that they are being followed and being monitored. And if they're not being successful, we understand why and put in support mechanisms in place to be able to achieve that. So the 6-point action plan, like we discussed, is about gathering data. We're progressing to publish data annually on our website, reporting annually on diversity statistics, which is key, and having a page on our website which maps out the targets that we're looking to hit, and really tangibly demonstrates what we've been able to achieve and potentially what we're not have been able to achieve, and the mechanisms we're putting in place to rectify that. We talk about, ensuring executive support in inclusiveness and the targets, and really getting that message sort of upstream with the board and downstream with the wider team, and also with our sort of council colleagues. Embedding diversity as a KPI, so we're reporting regularly against that KPI and looking at how we're performing and what can be improved. And something we've already undertaken is participating and mentoring or buddying opportunities to share experience. We've had a lot of speeches here today, and people generally have been talking through experience and their experience in the industry, or what experience they've experienced firsthand. And there's no better sort of learning curve than that, and how we can translate that to results. We need to, raise awareness, whether this is with internal customers or external customers, ensuring that there's a constant review and that we've got up-to-date training to hand, establishing networks within the borough or outside the borough. And we've talked about that earlier about, some establishments have been, in fruition for several years now. And it's really about linking into those establishments and really, understanding the sort of learning path that they've experienced and how we can incorporate that within our organisation. And we talk about mentoring and training. Mentoring is a real key part, and coaching and making sure that we train and support, that we get people in these positions and we give them the ability to excel in the organisation. We've looked at our recruitment policy, like I've added earlier, and we're constantly, one of the things that we're continuing to do is constantly evaluate what we do. There's no, as a new organisation, we've got procedures and policies, many that I have had an influence in, but nevertheless that doesn't mean that they're fixed in stone. We're always pushing the bar, testing the boundaries, seeing what can evolve, what needs to be flexed, what works and what doesn't. And within that recruitment strand, we've looked at ways that internally we can improve recruitment, how we can get that message out, how we can reach a wider environment. And we continually evolve and we continually review as a team. And that's across the team, not just the exec team, that's the wider team, to see, what can be improved. We talk about, developing leadership. Everything is led from the front. I'm pleased to say, the HFL board is very supportive and diverse. The exec team within HFL is, again, very diverse team with all their different experiences. And, we communicate well as an organisation, and we filter that down to our colleagues, and we're always taking viewpoints from all aspects of the business to improve our leadership and to make sure that support is there for people to come into the organisation. And finally, a key thing is lead by example. Taking visible roles in promoting initiatives and, you know, leading from the front, whether it's, you know, the CEO, the exec team, the senior leadership team in HFL. You know, we empower all our staff members within our organisation, you know, to speak up, to communicate, to lead. A lot of them are empowered to make their own, you know, decisions in terms of recruitment, and we encourage that, we support that, and we constantly review our methodologies. And again, we put this slide in just to look at what, you know, we always are looking at what the market is doing and what other people are doing well and not so well. And it's that constant, you know, evolving and sort of recognition of what works and what doesn't, and not being fixated on certain things, and being flexible enough to change approaches or amend or flex approaches to ensure that we can, you know, get the right result in the end in terms of getting that kind of diversity within the organisation that already exists and promote within, and to give people the opportunity to develop a career. You know, it's not just about, as mentioned before, a tick box exercise to get people in for a short term. You know, we really want to get people in the organisation, establish careers, and have longevity within the borough and within our organisation.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, couldn't uncheck.
And really, I just wanted to finish off with saying, you know, like I said at the beginning, that presentation was all on recruitment, but it's a strand that we do throughout everything we do within the organisation moving forward in terms of, you know, local supply chain, procurement at any level. We're doing a big piece at the moment in terms of consultants and how we can get, you know, diversity in consultants, companies delivering schemes on behalf of HFL, and whether that is through individual appointments or partnerships, and also through, you know, the awarding of, you know, contractor delivery contracts, and how we can tie in our aspirations with, you know, contractors and delivering within the borough.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jason. And I'm sure I'll be coming back to you for some of the great questions that you have in the Q&A box. So if you do have questions, this is the last call for questions. We don't have much time, but I'll try to get through those questions. I'll ask those questions. I'll put, you know, a question to each panelist so that we don't have, you know, several answers, but just one. And I'll start off with Jatinder. Let me just get the gallery view up. There we go. And the first question for you, Jatinder, is, so have there been any challenges that you've seen with the implementation of this EDI policy, if any?
No, I don't think there has been, because we are such a young organisation. And there's a couple of things to say here. The first is that everyone in this organisation has been selected to work here for particular skills and qualities. So everyone who's come to us has wanted to come, and everyone who's in has been wanted in the organisation. So hopefully we have what is an engaged team. We also, as a young organisation, we have no baggage. So we don't have an established way of doing things. Sometimes that, you know, can make people look over at us and think, oh, what are they up to now? But it also means we are that nimble little tugboat. We don't have to sort of take days to sort of turn ourselves around. If we want to, we can make decisions quite quickly. So, for example, this morning we were talking about in our EDI group meeting, we were talking about publishing some of the work that we've been doing on our equality prospectus, and there's no reason to do this. There's no requirement to do this. There's no regulatory requirement to publish this, but actually we think it would be a good idea to share some of the information. We've, as a group, sort of been looking at what we can do. Our ideas have been brought in. Everyone's been able to comment, and we've found a new way of working. And we really want to share that and want people to just, you know, you can borrow our ideas, take them away. The more that they're replicated in other organisations, the better. So, no, I don't think we have had particular difficulties. I think we've been lucky. We're very open. The group is very honest, we challenge with respect, and we just push this agenda ahead. You've got a real enthusiasm to see some real change come out of what we're doing. And I think that the killing of George Floyd literally was a pivotal moment, and for HFL, it struck a huge chord. I'm sure the staff can remember the meeting that we held last year, where we just needed to listen to what was being said and to act upon it. And that's what we've been able to do.
Thank you very much. Eamon, you mentioned about your career, some of the challenges you faced in the 90s working as a diplomat. Obviously, that's a significant job to have, particularly in the 90s as well, as a black man. Was there any glass ceiling that you felt at that time that you couldn't break?
I'll be honest with you. Obviously, I'll be honest with you. Yes, I would say, because at the time in the Foreign Office, the way to get into, shall we say, I got to middle management, but to become into senior management, there was something called assessment development centres, which were in place. Then when you were from a certain background, shall we say, so if I wasn't a Oxford and Cambridge or one of the Russell Group universities, people who came from that background were assessed on potential. I was assessed on demonstrating what I had to give evidence. So when you're therefore, so when you are being assessed on evidence and then you don't have the opportunity to give evidence, well, then how are you going to be promoted? Yeah. But then, when I first joined the Foreign Office, working on European policy was seen as kind of elitist and the top brand of you were going places in the diplomatic service. But I managed, after probably maybe 15 years or 16 years, I can't remember, I got a job doing European policy, earning my way to that table. But there was a distinct difference between myself, how hard I had to work to get to that table. And then, and referring to the glass ceiling point, if I took you all to lunch in the Foreign Office and we went walking around and you would say, oh, this place is fantastic, it's quite diverse and everything. But then if I took you into a meeting where the decisions were being made, then you would see a significant difference in the colour of the people where the decisions are being made in the Foreign Office. Yeah. And then the other thing, which people sometimes don't realise, there's a class thing. So therefore, if you were, if you were of the same colour, everybody spoke with the same type of language. So, and what I mean by that, so therefore, the backgrounds for people being successful were near enough all of the same, rather than diverse. And the ironic thing is that if you are in the world of diplomacy, being able to relate to people from different races and backgrounds and creeds and colours should be an advantage, because that's what you need in order to get through to people. So in my opinion, I did feel there was a glass ceiling. But then, although I will not criticise my former, because I had a wonderful career.
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. And actually, we could host a whole event about race and class and how that actually impacts things. I mean, I remember, my mum was very, very strict about the way I spoke and stuff like that. She'd be like, don't say that kind of word or speak like this and stuff like that. And that was all so that I could, have better kind of life chances and stuff like that. Yes. But there's a report that came out last week about the civil service and the kind of, the makeup of it. And apparently, senior people just break into Latin from time to time, which just tells you what that. I don't think I can speak Latin, but I don't know of anyone else. Samantha, there's a really good question about experiences and microaggressions, for example, in the workplace. And I know you've kind of indicated that you'd like to answer this question. Do you find yourself internalizing these things in other workplaces in your life? Have you ever felt like leaving a job due to racism, or directly or indirectly?
No, I couldn't afford to leave because of racism.
Yeah.
I think one of the things about being a Black person, being born Black, is that you develop a very thick skin, and you develop that thick skin from a very early age. So by the time you get to the workplace, you can shoulder a lot of those microaggressions, a lot of the overt racism, a lot of the discrimination. It can take a toll on your mental health. So you do have to stay kind of buoyant. You do have to draw on sources of support to get you through that, and to talk to people regularly around shared experiences. I think that's really important, to have that mutual support group in place, because it can be quite lonely, particularly if you're one of very few Black people in an organisation. So I do think that's really important. I think one of the microaggressions, if you can call it this, that comes to mind is I started a new job in the Shires, and the PA to the CEO came down to greet me. And when she came through the door, she just looked me up and down, and she had this look of distaste on her face. And when I put my hand out, this is pre-COVID, to shake her hand, I just got this limp hand moving forward. Like, I really don't want to touch you, but I don't feel, because I'm very English and polite, I can actually point blank refuse. So that, and I just thought, okay, this is the kind of organisation I'm working in. So yes, it's not uncommon.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I've experienced that as well, numerous occasions. Jason, I think this will probably be the last question. How do you, obviously EDI is, a lot of people feel uncomfortable talking about race and equality and diversity and stuff like that. How do you get across that to colleagues that might feel uncomfortable with that conversation, don't really understand it, for example?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think, as touched on, in the presentation earlier, we're lucky enough within our organisation to be such a size that we're quite open. We communicate quite often between senior management and exec level and board, and it's all through the ability to be able to communicate and understand, the collective kind of culture that we're trying to instill within Homes to Lambeth. It is a challenge. I won't lie. Working in construction for 20 years, there's not many people of colour that you come across on construction sites, in the management capacity in the team, and even through a consultancy basis. So. And it's something that we need to, and that we're putting plans in place to try and, improve in terms of working closely with groups from different diversities, and whether that's through partnerships, through main contracting partnerships, or big multidiscipline partnerships. But it's something that will take some time to work through, because it's just not there. I won't lie to you. It's there's not these kind of groups that are just there that we can just pull off and pull down and work with. So it's really about identifying, practices that have got similar cultures to ours, organisations that got similar ethos to ours, and really working collaboratively to work through that pipeline. And develop a strategy so we can achieve our collective, targets and aspirations.
Brilliant, absolutely, couldn't say better. So, thank you all very much. Unfortunately, I have to stop there, and apologies if I've not got to your question, but those are some really good questions that we had from the audiences. Thank you to all of the speakers for taking your time out, and thank you to Philippa for organising this session and this series. It's a very important series for us to talk about these, and I think it's fair to say we'll be doing more of this in the future. So keep an eye out on our social media, and yeah, thank you very much for coming, and have a lovely day.
Thank you all.
Thank
Well
you.
done. Thank you.